Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on history of English literature. So far we have conducted 12 lectures under this series and all these lectures are available for you on YouTube. So you can access these lectures and give your feedback to us. Dear friends, I would like to tell you all carrying this very series on history of English literature further. Today we would be talking on the elder romantics. In the first session we would be discussing on the romantic movement, and in the other half we would be discussing on Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey. And for this very discussion we have once again with us within our studios Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is an eminent academician. He has been author of various books as well as he has been guide to various students also. He is formerly Vice Chancellor of Kurukshetra University. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya, under whose able guidance we would be discussing on the elder romantics. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. Well, in this lecture we will talk about the romantic movement in English literature. But before we do that, two general things are important to be understood about English literature. One is that it cannot be viewed in isolation. Whatever happens in English literature is always related to whatever has already happened in the neighboring European countries, particularly France and Germany, which are just adjacent. So all the literary movements that we have in Europe, they are interlinked. It may start in Germany, it will spread to France and England. It may start in Italy, it will again spread in these very countries. So that is one thing we must understand, that you cannot understand it properly if you try to isolate it from the rest of Europe and European literature. Number two, in English literature, there has always been a sort of action and reaction equation. Something comes, then something in reaction to that comes, so on and so forth. So a chain becomes then of the contraries. As Blake said, without contraries there is no progression. And we see in practical form in English literature that the progression of English literature, its growth, its development, has been through this principle of opposites reacting to each other and progress taking place. Just like the Newtonian law of friction, that action and reaction. So friction will come as a reaction to action, and the movement takes place because of that friction. If the opposites were not there, there will be no progression. So how close the statement in literature by Blake, without contraries there is no progression, and the one in science by Newton, physics, they are very similar, and both were about the same time in history. That is also important. So which means there are simultaneous movements in life in general as well as in the arts or literature. So these two things as way of general understanding of English literature. Now, as for the Romantic movement, again, it is not confined to England alone. Actually, it started outside of England. It started in Germany and then spread to France and then finally to England. Also, to remember, it is important that we see a link between the historical events of life and the literary movements that take place, that come and go. So here also, behind the movement of Romantic literature, there were certain events of history. The first was the American War of Independence, which began in 1773, ended in 1776. It was followed by the French Revolution, 1789, where the royalty, the dictatorship of one ruler was removed, and each individual got a share in the governance of the country. So that happened in 1789. So these two importance are behind the Romantic movement in Europe. And as I said, the Romantic movement actually started in Germany. We had these legal brothers. They started it. And Coleridge went to Germany. He got in touch with them. He looked closely into the ingredients of the new movement and brought those ideas back to England. And then from England, those very ideas traveled to America. So that's how literary movements travel from one place to another. They move from one literary history into the history of another literature. So, from Germany to France to England, that was the course of movement of the Romantic movement. In Germany, the two important figures in this connection were Kant and Hegel. Hegel's years are 1770 to 1831. Born in 1770, died in 1831. And Kant, Immanuel Kant, he was born in 1724, senior to Hegel, and died in 1804, died also earlier. Well, their philosophy was philosophy of idealism, and that is essentially the nature of the Romantic view of life and Romantic view of literature. And as can be seen, it was in reaction against the materialism of the neoclassical age. During the 17th, 18th century, largely the period of the neoclassical movement, there was dominance of materialism, and rightly, because the stage of scientific inventions also at that time were confined to this, Newton and company, and they had discovered certain physical laws. So it was physics, physical sciences, which were dominant during the neoclassical era. But as you move from the neoclassical materialism to the romantic spiritualism, many things change. So the focus now is not external life, not surface life, not material life, but the life inside, internal. Because their view of life is that life is organic. Things are linked up one with the other. And the entire universe, as well as the entire life of an individual. So it may be universe, it may be the human individual. Both are an expression of something spiritual inside them. So the outer expression, the material expression, is nothing but an expression of what is there inside. So this was something very new. It was not there earlier. Earlier, material reality on the surface, nothing behind or nothing before, and therefore it had to be reasoned out, analyzed, etc., on the surface. But now you don't have to be stuck up with the surface alone. In fact, there is more concern, greater concern with what is behind it. And behind is something else, which is spiritual, which is emotional, and which is imaginary, which is ideal, and it has very little to do with what is there on the surface. In fact, what is there on the surface is nothing but an expression of what is there inside. So this is the organic view of life. This is biological view of life, not the physical, not the material. So biological and spiritual, organic view of life. Nothing can be viewed in isolation. Everything has to be looked at in terms of its relations with others. So it is this kind of this kind of holistic view of life as well as literature. So as I said, romantic movement in English literature came from its neighboring countries. It originated in Germany. So it was essentially an individualistic movement. Neoclassical movement was based on generalizations, general principles, and therefore they had charted out everything in terms of rules, regulations, etc. But now you cannot split any reality into this kind of neat physical surface material divisions. Its nature being organic, it has to be viewed as a whole. You cannot look into parts. So, that is why its impact on literature was that the romantic lyrical poems, by nature short, because emotion cannot be sustained to the epic size, to the epic length. By nature, it will have to be short lived. Hence, romantic poetry is in short poems. It is lyrical, and hence lyrics, just like the songs of the sparrow, birds. So, you have those little songs, and that is what romantic poetry is. In English literature, the originators, the pioneers of the romantic movement were Wordsworth and Coleridge. In 1798, the famous year, they brought out a collection of poems called lyrical ballads. Lyrical ballads. So, lyric was one emphasis which was not there in the neoclassical, because in the neoclassical the model was the epic, and epic by its very nature is rhetorical, because the kind of characters you have and the way they try to influence each other, so they indulge in rhetorical speeches. Whereas in the lyric, you are not really communicating with anyone else outside of yourself. So it is talking to yourself. It becomes internal, it is not external. And since it is related to emotion, it has to be short lived, because emotion cannot be sustained or prolonged for a very long time. You have a feeling and then it goes, something else comes, something else interferes. That is how life goes. So, lyric by its very nature has to be short lived, has to be inward looking, whereas the neoclassical poem was outward looking. It belonged to the surface of life. It addressed what is before you, the material life that you see, that you hear, that you live through, that you practice. But here it deals with something that you do not really see on the surface. You feel it, it is inside you, but it can't be shown out there. So, you are not holding mirror up to nature, as Hamlet says in Shakespeare. It is just holding mirror to yourself, to the inside. So, romantic poetry by its very nature, number one, is individualistic. The unit of humanity is the individual, not humanity as such, not community, not state, not society, individual man, single. Second is that it has to be lyrical, even musical. That is why they went back to the medieval folklore, which was discarded by the neoclassical poets. So, here they revived the medieval myths, folklore, all that. That is why they are writing ballads, lyrical ballads, Now 18th century, the neoclassical poets never wrote ballads. Their poetry was more talking to each other and talking in terms of reason, rationality, rules, what to do, what not to do. But here you are rendering your feelings, your emotions. How do you feel? Joy of life, sorrow of life, which are by nature short-lived. So lyrical poetry, intense poetry, individualistic poetry, short, musical, and it revived the ballads, because ballads are also popular songs, popular poetry, and short poems, because you quickly sing them. Just while passing through streets, you are singing a song. It was this kind of poetry which Wordsworth and Coleridge created in the form of lyrical ballads, which was published in 1798. So, end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th. So, beginning of the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century is officially then the period of the Romantic movement. And it went on. These were the pioneers, as I said. These were the elder poets. They will be later followed by the younger ones, like Byron, Shelley, Keats, second generation of Romantic poets. This first generation, they were actually born in the 18th century. They were born in a different atmosphere. Atmosphere which was neoclassical, materialistic, but now very different kind of, just the opposite of it takes place. So that is the difference always between the first generation and the second generation. And we will complete the story by and by, but right now it is these elder poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and third one, Sade, who unfortunately is overshadowed by these two. They form the leading group and they played the role. Thank you. Okay. Well, to continue that story, as I said, the pioneers of the Romantic movement were these three tall figures. They were, in a way, the leaders of the movement: Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey. And Wordsworth and Coleridge together brought out the lyrical ballads. And preface to the lyrical ballads, which was largely written by Wordsworth, that was a sort of manifesto of Romantic poetry, how it is different from the neoclassical, and what are the ingredients, the emphases, the worldview, the literary view, all that was explained by Wordsworth in preface to the lyrical ballads, which was appended, prefixed to those poems, which was a collection in collaboration with Coleridge. So that is how it came about. Later, after this pioneering work, then individually they wrote their own poems because the movement had been launched. Now they got down to their individual compositions, business. And Wordsworth, having greater poetic talent, more gifted, he wrote the longest poems, and a romantic epic, as it is called, he wrote the prelude. Epic traditionally is associated with classical and neoclassical poetry. In fact, more properly, the classical, because even neoclassical is not epic proper, that becomes mock epic, although trying to follow the same traditions. But the Romantic poets were not imitators of the classical school, classical rules of creating and constructing poems. They were actually reacting against the classical, and therefore they were giving a counter philosophy of life, counter poetics of literature, and counter or opposite view of man as well as a poem. So that's why in Wordsworth and Coleridge you have in these lyrical ballads poems very different from what Dryden and Pope had written. So now you have short poems, intense poems, speaking to your heart and speaking about everyday things that you live through, that you do. Whereas neoclassical poetry had nothing to do with your daily life. That was confined to, let's say, very special kind of activities of your life. For example, bar rooms, club life, coffee houses. So it was that, a pastime kind of thing, and dealing with the pastime aspect of your life. But here poetry addresses the serious aspects of life, your emotional life, your joys, your sorrows. So it is these that you have in the lyrical ballads. But the major poem, the epic poem, that Wordsworth wrote was the Prelude, which he completed and published in 1805. That is called the Romantic epic, very different from the classical. It doesn't have those battles and wars. It doesn't have heroes. So, it has just individuals, unheroic, more concerned with their private lives rather than with public glory, public heroism. They don't do that. So it is that kind of quiet, individualistic, private, intense, emotional, lyrical poetry. So even when the prelude is of epic size, one poem is a book length poem running into several hundred pages. So what does Wordsworth do? He is not telling the story of any hero. He is telling his own story. So the Romantic epic essentially is autobiographical. So Wordsworth is writing about himself and not about any public hero, not about any political figure. So it is internal. It is an exploration of what is there inside a personality. It is not about external life. So that is the difference between the classical and the Romantic. Coleridge also wrote long poems, but not as long. Coleridge, for example, wrote Christabel. Interesting story, more like a ballad, a folk tale, than about himself. Not writing about himself. He's writing someone else's story, popular one, which will appeal to people in general. So that is the difference between Wordsworth and Coleridge. And that's why Wordsworth is generally accused of being egotistical, that he cannot move away from himself. Give him any subject to write about, and ultimately he ends up by making it a personal poem. So that is viewed as a limitation of Wordsworth as a poet. Coleridge, being a more philosophic mind, not hung up with his own self, not being egotistical, but rather being philosophic, thoughtful. So he is more interested in the general philosophic ideas of life. So he tends to generalize, whereas Wordsworth tends to interiorize, individualize. Coleridge tends to externalize, generalize, philosophize. So very different kind of personalities obviously would produce different kinds of poetry. But then one thing is common, that both share the essential traits of the Romantic poetics, Romantic aesthetics, which are that essentially it is internal rather than external. That essentially it is individualistic rather than generalistic. And then essentially it is lyrical and not rhetorical or epical or dramatic. So these are some of the general features which are essential to romantic poetry, which makes it different. So Wordsworth and Coleridge did that. Sade's name is also associated with them. In fact, all the three lived together. They went into a sort of self-imposed exile. They thought England was not a very fit country for poets like them. You remember later Yeats will say about Ireland, this is no country for old men and so on. And therefore he says, I will go to Byzantium, because here this country is for the young in one another's arms and so on. So similarly, Wordsworth and Coleridge and Sade, they realized that England was not the right kind of country for their kind of poetry and their kind of poetic life they wanted to lead. Because there had to be something antisocial about it, something bohemian about it, something not very common to everyday life. What common people are doing, these romantics being more sensitive, more introvert, more individualistic, they will certainly be different from the common people. So they thought they have to have a place of their own, which has to be a place of their choice, which has an autonomy of the individual self, which is not disturbed by the humbug, by the noises of the material, the outside world. Hence, these three, along with of course later others, they moved to Italy. They lived in Italy, not in England, because Italy, they thought, was the proper place, and the men of letters there, the poets, other writers, they had the proper bent of mind, proper aptitude, proper attitude to life and letters, which was not being appreciated in England. Therefore, to feel more at home and to have fellow writers who would understand you, who would appreciate you, and from whom you would learn something. So with this view, they moved to Italy. Coleridge, you know, as I said, wrote different kind of poetry. He was not egotistical. He was not hung up with his own self, with his own emotional life. So he wrote Christabel and even his ballads, that have nothing to do with themselves, even indirectly, they don't reflect anything of his personality or life related to him, which is the case with Wordsworth. With Wordsworth, nothing stays unrelated to his own person, unrelated to his own self. So, subjectivity is very strong there. Well, in his later life, when he had made a mark, when he was considered the tallest among the English poets, he was made a poet laureate, Sarkari poet in a way. That's an honor given to him by the government. But then poets do not like this kind of patronage, because they think if you have accepted the patronage of a government, then you will not be critical of what the government is doing. By and large, you will have to approve of what the government is doing. So you do not have your artistic independence. You do not have your autonomous self. That is why when he accepted poet laureateship, the younger poets who at one time saw the ideal in him, saw a path breaker, saw a leader, now were greatly disappointed. They thought they had been let down by their leaders. And one of them, who became later a great poet in his own right, Robert Browning, in the Victorian age, next age, following Wordsworth, he became a major poet. But when Wordsworth became the poet laureate, Browning was a young poet, upcoming. And he had been influenced by Wordsworth. He had seen in Wordsworth a sort of guru, a sort of fatherly figure, a poet from whom he could learn a good deal. But now he was deeply disappointed, so much so that he couldn't help writing a poem. The poem is The Lost Leader. So he called Wordsworth the lost leader. Lost to his admirers, lost to the public as a whole, and he sold himself to the government. That was the accusation that Browning levelled in his poem, The Lost Leader. The very first line is really very insulting. The first line is, a handful of silver, for a handful of silver he sold us. So that is what he thinks Wordsworth did. He sold us, the community of poets. He sold art, he sold the artists, just for a few pennies. So for a handful of silver, he sold us. He left us. For a handful of silver, he left us. So lost leader. At one time they saw in him the leader for the Romantic movement. but now they felt let down by the leader. Hence, this kind of attack on him. Well, as for Coleridge, Coleridge was neither a leader nor a disappointment. He was more interested in his own ideas. He was more of a philosopher than a poet. And he was more curious to learn philosophy. So that's why he went to Germany, and Kant, Hegel, Schlegel brothers got in touch with them, exchanged his philosophic ideas with them, and came back home with a good deal of new ideas about the romantic thought. And that brought about a great change in English literature, in the movement, in the direction, in the nature of English literature. And later, of course, it did not remain confined to England alone. Coleridge influenced the Americans also. So all these so-called transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Walcott, these poets, and then minor poets of the period, and finally Walt Whitman. So this group of poets in America, between Emerson and Whitman, they were called transcendentalists. They believe, like the Romantics, in reality being not material but spiritual and transcendental. Transcendental, which transcends the physical, which goes beyond the material. So that is why it is called transcendentalism. And these poets came to be called that. And all that was under the influence of Coleridge. S.T. Coleridge had written a philosophic book called Aids to Reflection. So that book, Aids to Reflection, more than any book of poems or any book of manifestos about new poetry, that became much more influential in America, among the American poets and other writers, than any other book. Not Wordsworth, not Sade had that kind of influence outside their own country, as Coleridge had, and most so in America. And this group of poets that I mentioned, the so-called transcendentalists, they were directly influenced by Coleridge's own book, Aids to Reflection. So that's how the movement, as I said in the very beginning, the movements in Europe, they are not confined to any country or nationality or community or language. They spread all over, they are interrelated, and English being also the national language of America, having the same culture, the same literature. Obviously, this spreads to America also. It links up with them too. So you have to see it in the context, and the context as in another context. One of the critics says that he is a structuralist himself. He says every literary composition, it may be a poem or a play or a novel, short or long, it has a context. So every text has a context. But then he says the context is boundless. The text is context bound, but context is boundless. So that is the relationship between the text and context. The boundaries and the boundarylessness. So the interrelationships between and among the literary texts, that's very important. That's why later T.S. Eliot, one of the major figures in Anglo-American literature, in his famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, he emphasizes this very point. He says, no artist exists individually. He exists in the context of the tradition to which he or she belongs. So the artist has to be viewed in relationship to the tradition to which he belongs. So there is a definite space, there is a definite position and definite contribution that each individual artist makes to the tradition to which he belongs. So that is how tradition grows, tradition develops from the classical to the neoclassical to the romantic to the Victorian to the modern, so on and so forth. So history will keep growing. It is always in the making. So Wordsworth, Coleridge, Sade, they were pioneers of the Romantic movement. So they laid the foundation and created these gigantic, I would say, texts of Romanticism, and they became model for the subsequent poets. Of course, there were prose writers also. We'll talk about them some other time. The movement was not confined to poetry alone. The movement was in other forms of literature also, like prose, like fiction, like drama, even criticism. So in all these branches of literature, you could see the spread, the impact of the Romantic movement. So that is how the story goes about the beginning and the rise of Romanticism in English literature. Thank you for the day.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us detailed information on elder romantics. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that tomorrow also we would be meeting and would be discussing on younger romantics. Till then, keep watching these lectures and keep giving your feedback. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.